In a pocket of my wedding dress, where by all rules of tailoring, nothing should exist but a thin strip of lining, a small, flat key was sewn in. It was a key to my condo on Lakeshore Drive. A simple, almost superstitious habit I'd developed years ago, back when my only possessions were rented rooms, other people's wallpaper, and the constant feeling that a real home was a long way off, and if I ever got one, I'd have to defend it with my teeth. I never told anyone about that key, not even Leland. And I certainly never explained why I might need a back door to my own home on the day I was supposed to become a permanent part of a completely different family. It was just that somewhere deep inside me, a calm, sober certainty always lived. That one day, paperwork, doors, and locks might be needed faster than a single explanation could be offered, and that a person who has built something from the ground up with their own two hands must always have a way to get back to that ground zero, at any moment, without anyone else's permission or involvement. I'm telling this story in the first person because tales of how a woman one day stops being convenient for other people's plans are always more honest that way, without intermediaries or softened edges. This story didn't begin in the banquet hall, or with the phrase "you probably came here to hear." It started much earlier, with two very ordinary condos. One I bought as a wreck, practically a shell, and the other I inherited from my grandmother and estate realtors gently refer to as needing a complete renovation. It started with the stubborn, almost maniacal desire to turn those two boxes of concrete and old plaster into the one safe place on earth where no one could ever make me feel like a guest. My professional breakthrough, as I've always seen it, was the moment photos of my renovated Lakeshore Drive condo were featured in a major interior design magazine. The editor, who had previously been politely declining pitches from up-and-coming designers without a name, saw the pictures of the bright living room with its preserved historic crown molding and the hardwood floors laid in a unique diagonal pattern. She called me personally and asked for a full spread. That feature, which ran with a large photo of me standing by the window of my own living room, brought the first wave of truly high-paying clients, the kind willing to entrust serious budgets to a then little-known designer. From that day on, I never forgot that my studio's success had literally grown from the walls of that specific condo, not from someone's generosity or a lucky break. My name is Alara Vance, and for the last few years, I've run my own restoration and interior design studio. It's a small but resilient firm that started with one laptop on the kitchen table of a rented studio apartment and gradually grew into a company with a real office, a dozen employees on salary, and a reputation that has clients booking me 6 months in advance. I never liked telling outsiders how much work it took, because the details sounded too much like a complaint, and I don't know how to complain, nor do I want to. I just realized one day that I would either build my own business myself, with my own hands and at my own risk, or I'd spend my life as a tool in someone else's projects. I chose the former, even when it meant sleeping 4 hours a night and eating takeout pizza amidst construction dust and rolls of wallpaper. The first condo, the one on Lakeshore Drive, I bought before I ever met Leland. I bought it from an elderly couple moving abroad to be with their children, and they were selling it practically as is, with ancient knob and tube wiring and water stains on the ceilings. I wasn't a studio back then, just a freelance designer starting out with a limited amount of savings. The decision to pour almost everything I had into that broken-down space seemed like a reckless gamble to many people I knew, but I didn't see what they saw. I didn't see the cracks and the peeling tiles. I saw a future showcase apartment with high ceilings, light oak floors, and the very layout I would later use as my calling card in my first portfolio, showing clients what you could create from true chaos. The second condo came to me from my maternal grandmother, a woman who lived modestly her whole life but stubbornly saved for that apartment, buying it for her daughter, my mother, who never had the chance to move in. Then it passed to me, and I renovated it with my own hands, literally. I chose the tile myself, argued with the team of electricians myself, and painted one of the hallways deep into the night because there wasn't enough time during the day and the deadlines were tight. That condo is now a long-term rental, and for me, it's not just a source of income but a living reminder of a person who is no longer here, and of the things you earn not by birthright, but through care and hard work. While renovating the Lakeshore Drive place, I gave in to an old designer's habit of hiding technical inconveniences behind beautiful solutions. I asked the crew to build a small safe into a closet wall, disguised as a decorative panel made from the same wood as the cabinet fronts. The idea came to me after a client of mine had jewelry stolen from her wide-open apartment during a renovation. I decided then that I would not allow such carelessness in my own home. The panel opened with a tricky mechanism that, it seemed, only I and the craftsman who installed it knew. Inside, I kept the original deeds to both condos, some of my grandmother's heirloom jewelry, and a small stash of cash for emergencies. It was a habit that even Bryn, my business partner, once gently teased me about, calling me a person with a smuggler's syndrome. But she wasn't truly surprised by such foresight. She knew from experience how many times a simple piece of paper, readily available at the right moment, had saved someone's nerves and money. Neither of these properties was part of some grand plan for enrichment. They were simply my foundation, my proof to myself that I could build something solid, even when nothing around seemed reliable. And that is precisely why, when years later, someone dared to lay claim to them as if they weren't the result of my sleepless nights but some communal pot to be dipped into on demand, something cold and very calm awoke within me, something I had never noticed in myself to such an extent before. Before I tell you about the wedding and what happened that night under the string lights and the clinking of glasses, I should probably explain where I got this almost animalistic habit of keeping my documents in order and my feelings separate from my finances. My studio didn't start with the confident launch of a successful entrepreneur. It started with one extremely bad first gig. A young couple, for whom I'd agreed to do a renovation practically for free just to build a portfolio, refused to pay the remaining half of the bill at the last minute, claiming our relationship was friendly, not commercial. I had to learn from scratch how to draft a proper contract, to never find myself in such a humiliating situation again. That bitter experience taught me one simple thing. Warm words about trust and family are too often just a convenient cover for a simple unwillingness to pay your bills. Since then, I've signed any significant document only after carefully reading every single line, no matter how close I thought the person on the other side of the table was. That's when I met my longtime attorney, Mr. Davies, a short, balding man with an unchanging habit of adjusting his glasses with his index finger before stamping another document. He handled the affairs of my very first clients, and over time, my studio began designing interiors for a whole network of his lawyer colleagues and several law firms. So, the question of where to find a competent lawyer in a pinch was never as acute for me as it was for most of my peers. I didn't just have one specialist on call. I had a whole professional network of vetted experts I turned to as needed, just as I would turn to a trusted tile supplier or a reliable team of electricians. I met Leland Asher at a professional trade show for interior solutions. He was there with his mother, who was representing a small line of decorative textiles. He struck me as a gentle and attentive man, the kind who knows how to listen without interrupting and can genuinely admire someone else's achievements without a hint of envy. The way he tilted his head slightly to the side as he listened to me talk about my concept for restoring historic properties was so disarming that I, accustomed to keeping a distance from new people, quickly allowed myself to relax around him. I dismissed the occasional oddities in his family's behavior as the usual awkwardness of a first meeting. Leland's mother, Eleanor Asher, gave the impression of an energetic and business-minded woman. She held herself straight, spoke loudly and confidently, and loved to talk about how she had built a small family business in her youth. She took obvious pleasure in pointing out the details of others' success, as if trying them on for size. There was a characteristic sharpness in her gestures. She had a habit of tapping her index finger on the table to emphasize her points. She also wore large rings on almost every finger, which clinked together whenever she gestured emotionally while telling another story of her own enterprise. Leland's father, Richard Asher, was a man of a completely different sort, quiet, reserved, with a habit of remaining silent for long stretches, studying you over his glasses as if assessing whether you were worth the words. At our first meeting, he said maybe 10 sentences in total, but each was so precise and to the point that it seemed to me, this silent man was the one who actually held all the important family decisions in his hands. He just preferred not to show it in public. Leland's sister, Kinsley, was younger than her brother and worked, in her own words, in event planning. Though what she actually did day to day, I never really understood. Even after years of knowing her, she had a flashy, slightly provocative style of dress, a love for speaking loudly and breathlessly, and a habit of slightly squinting one eye when she was telling a story she didn't entirely believe herself. I noticed this trait pretty quickly but didn't give it much thought at the time, chalking it up to the theatrical mannerisms of someone used to working with people. To be honest, at the beginning of our relationship, I was not the cold, calculating woman I probably seem in this story. In the first week of knowing Leland, I came home after our third date and burst into tears in my kitchen out of a completely ridiculous, almost childish happiness. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I might actually have found someone who wasn't immediately trying to assess the value of my condo or the potential of my business. And Bryn, who found me in that state, just silently poured 2 cups of tea and waited for me to calm down on my own, rightly figuring that sometimes it's more useful for a woman to just have a good cry than to listen to someone else's advice. That moment of sincere weakness remained one of the few I allowed myself in all the years that followed. And I'm not ashamed of it at all. It's just that back then, I still knew how to trust people on credit, without demanding proof. The first months of my relationship with Leland were wonderfully calm and warm. He would often drop by my project sites just to see how the work was progressing, bring coffee for my crew, ask about the details of the projects, and genuinely rejoice when another client was thrilled with the result. It was then that I first let myself think that maybe I had found a man who could share not just the holidays with me, but the day-to-day grind, full of exhaustion, dirt, and the constant small crises of construction. And that thought warmed me more than any romantic gesture. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, questions of a completely different nature began to creep into our conversations. First, Eleanor would casually ask how many clients I had at the moment and what the average project cost was. Then, she wondered if my studio was structured as a joint family asset. And not long ago, at a family dinner, she remarked, as if joking, that it was high time for modern young couples to stop dividing property into mine and yours. Because a real family is always a communal pot from which everyone who has truly invested in that family can draw as needed. I laughed it off at the time, citing a professional habit of keeping business and personal life separate to avoid confusing the accounting. For a while, the topic died down, but I had already noted an important detail about Eleanor. She never forgot a question she had once asked. It was as if she filed them away in some internal cabinet, to be returned to at a more opportune moment. And an opportune moment, in her understanding, always seemed to be the moment of her conversational partner's greatest vulnerability. Sometime into our relationship, Leland proposed. I make him the creative director of my own studio. He suggested it so naturally and with such sincere faith in his own abilities that I, overcome with emotion and, let's be honest, the desire to have a partner by my side, not just a weekend boyfriend, agreed. I brought him into the company officially, with a full-time position and a respectable salary. At that moment, it seemed like a logical step, uniting our lives in practice, not just in words. Although my deputy, Bryn, an exceptionally businesslike person with no inclination for sentimentality, had very carefully noted that bringing someone into the business purely for personal reasons was a decision that should be made with a cold head, not in a fit of infatuation, and that the position should match actual skills, not the degree of intimacy in a relationship. Bryn had been with me almost since the studio's founding. She started as a simple project manager and eventually became my COO and, perhaps, the only person in the company whose opinion I always listened to without internal resistance. She had a dry way of speaking and almost never smiled in meetings, but she possessed a phenomenal memory for numbers and agreements. It was this cool-headed business sense of hers that had saved the studio more than once from frankly disastrous decisions that I, caught up in the creative side of a project, was ready to make on impulse. As creative director, Leland lasted exactly as long as it took for clients to start noticing the difference between his inspiring talks about concepts in meetings and the actual deadlines for project completion. He could talk beautifully about light, textures, and the mood of a space, but he was completely lost when it came to approving budgets, managing material delivery schedules, or talking to contractors who were used to the harsh, practical language of a construction site. He preferred to simply ignore any conflicts on site, shifting their resolution onto the shoulders of more experienced studio employees. About 6 months after Leland was hired, Eleanor, no longer hiding her interest, offered her own candidacy as a consultant for decorative textiles. She argued that she had extensive practical experience in the field and that it was a shame for the family to miss an opportunity to join forces for a common cause. Remembering my previous wariness, I tried to gently refuse, explaining that our staff was already full. But Leland pleaded with me so passionately and sincerely to give his mother a chance to prove herself that I, once again, stepping on the same rake of trust, agreed to bring her into the company as a consultant with a fixed salary. I didn't realize it then, but I was effectively creating a small but tightly knit cell within my own business. A group of people united not by common professional goals, but exclusively by family ties and a shared notion that my studio was meant, sooner or later, to become their family asset. I saw the decision merely as a gesture of goodwill toward my future family, not noticing how the real employees, who were honestly doing their jobs, were beginning to shoulder an extra burden for those who were on the payroll more by right of kinship than by right of competence. Nevertheless, on the surface, our life looked quite harmonious. Leland and I were planning to move in together, discussing the renovation of the Lakeshore Drive condo specifically for our life together, and attending family dinners with the Ashers, where Richard invariably remained silent, occasionally inserting short but sharp remarks. Kinsley generously shared stories of her supposedly grand event projects, squinting one eye at the most dubious parts of her narrative. I tried not to give these little things much importance, convincing myself that every family looks a bit strange from the outside, and getting used to others' habits is a normal part of building a new relationship. The first truly alarming bell rang about a year into our relationship, during another family dinner, when the conversation unexpectedly turned to real estate. Eleanor, skillfully steering the conversation to the point she wanted, casually asked if I wasn't planning to transfer the title of the Lakeshore Drive condo to Leland's name, so that the young family, as she put it, would have a shared space, arranged in a truly fair manner. She tapped her ring against the rim of her wine glass as she said it. For the first time, I felt not just awkwardness, but a real internal chill. Behind that phrase, I sensed something much more concrete than just concern for family comfort. I answered calmly but firmly that the condo was purchased by me long before I met Leland and would remain my sole property, regardless of the future of our relationship. The issue of living together, I said, could be resolved without a formal transfer of ownership. Eleanor just shrugged, with the air of someone who had simply offered a reasonable thought and didn't understand why I had taken it so seriously. But I caught the quick, meaningful glance she exchanged with Richard. That brief exchange of looks stayed with me far more than the words spoken. Eleanor made her first truly serious, though indirect, attempt at our engagement party, held at a country club restaurant for a small circle of relatives. Waiting for a moment when most of the guests had drifted out onto the terrace, she pulled me aside. Taking my elbow with the kind of confidential tone reserved for the most important conversations, she proposed that, for our collective convenience and family unity, we open a single-family checking account. She, Richard, Leland, and I would all contribute a portion of our income for major shared needs. She explained that a true family should trust each other with money, not hide it in separate stashes. Without changing my expression, I replied evenly, and without the slightest hesitation, that such a scheme works wonderfully for families where incomes are roughly comparable. For me, as the owner of a separate business with its own accounting and obligations to employees, such a merger would only create confusion and unnecessary questions from the IRS. So, with all due respect, I would prefer to keep my finances where they were, under my personal control. Eleanor didn't react verbally to the refusal. She just gave a picturesque smile and changed the subject to the flowers in my bouquet. But a minute later, standing next to Richard at the bar, she was speaking to him in a low, rapid voice, glancing in my direction from time to time. I couldn't hear a word of their conversation, but from the expression on her face, her tightly pressed lips, and the characteristic tapping of her ring against her glass, I understood perfectly. The first attempt had failed, not because the plan was abandoned, but because I just had to wait for the next, more insistent attempt, one prepared with my refusal in mind. A few weeks after that conversation, Bryn, while reviewing the studio's internal financial reports, brought a strange thing to my attention. The expenses on the corporate card issued to Eleanor as a consultant regularly exceeded the volume of work she had actually performed by several times. Some of the charges had no relation to the company's work needs at all, including quite large sums spent, according to the payment description, on a partnership contribution to some outside investment project I had never heard of. I decided not to bring it up directly yet, but to calmly observe how things developed, rightly judging that a premature scandal could destroy the relationship over what might be a simple accounting misunderstanding. However, calmly observing didn't last long. Just a month later, at another family dinner at the Asher house, when the second bottle of wine was empty and the conversation had traditionally turned to how wonderful it is that we'll all soon be one big family, Kinsley, slightly tipsy and flushed, suddenly leaned across the table toward me, lowering her voice to a supposedly confidential whisper. She mentioned that her mom had finally found a solid investment that was supposed to bring the family a serious profit very soon. And the person who organized it all had promised mountains of gold if they invested big and didn't delay. She added that the main thing now was not to scare away the luck with unnecessary formalities. And in that moment, her usually squinted, uncertain gaze cleared for a second. I then asked directly, without pressure, for details about this investment. What kind of project was it? Who was the guarantor? Were there documents? But Kinsley, immediately realizing she had said too much, habitually squinted one eye, pushed back from the table, and quickly changed the subject, saying her mom would explain everything when the time was right. Then, she demonstratively began pouring tea, as if the conversation about mountains of gold had never happened. It was that evening, driving home, that I first began to seriously think about the nature of the relationships within the Asher family. Too many things were adding up to one unpleasant picture. Eleanor's keen interest in my finances from our very first meeting, the persistent talk of transferring the condo title under the guise of family fairness, the strange expenses on the company's corporate card, the mysterious solid investment that required speed and a lack of formalities, and Richard's constant, almost rehearsed silence whenever such topics were discussed. But even then, I still allowed myself to believe that Leland, for all his softness and inability to make tough business decisions, was a man who genuinely loved me, and not just a convenient tool for achieving someone else's goals. When I cautiously asked him about his mother's investment, Leland just shrugged vaguely, saying his mom had always been an enterprising woman and that, in the end, it was her money and her right to do with it as she pleased. There was no wariness in his voice, no attempt to dig deeper into the issue, only the habitual, almost automatic desire to avoid any topic that could cause family tension. And in that moment, I felt for the first time with stark clarity that the person beside me wasn't so much protecting our shared interests as instinctively choosing the path of least resistance, leaving the full weight of real decisions on my shoulders. Around this time, a telling incident happened at one of my project sites, one I would later recall often when comparing the behavior of strangers to that of my new family. A client, the owner of a coffee shop chain, tried at the last minute to back out of a previously agreed-upon budget, claiming that friendly prices implied a much more modest payment than what was stipulated in the contract. And that's where my archive of notarized contracts, carefully collected over the years, played its decisive role. Calmly, without a single emotion in my voice, I laid out all the signed papers in front of him, showed him the specified deadlines and amounts. Half an hour later, the slightly embarrassed client transferred the entire remaining sum without a single objection. Leland, who happened to be present during this conversation, was genuinely impressed by my composure, remarking, "In moments like these, you become like an iceberg." Calm on the surface, but with enough strength underneath to sink any ship. I remember laughing heartily at the comparison then, not yet suspecting that very soon, the iceberg within me would be needed not for a coffee shop client, but for people much, much closer. In those months, Kinsley continued to pop into my life with more stories of her grand event projects. One day, she was organizing an exclusive fashion show for a select circle, the next a private party for investors. Yet, strangely, photos from these events never materialized, and her stories always ended with the same phrase. "This time we just did it without official contracts. We're all friends here." She had a habit of drawing out her words, delivering her most important lines with deliberate slowness, as if weighing the effect of each word. Her heavily mascaraed eyelashes would flutter whenever the conversation touched on the specific numbers of her income. Sometime later, bits of information reached me from mutual acquaintances in the construction industry. People who knew Richard from his previous work casually mentioned that a few years ago, he had been involved in a similar story in another family, where his daughter-in-law, after a divorce, lost a significant portion of their jointly acquired property precisely to the husband's family, all structured under the plausible pretext of family asset consolidation. This detail seemed to me not just a random coincidence, but rather a recurring family script, a script the Ashers had already tested once and were now, apparently, preparing to repeat, this time with me in the leading role of the victim. I didn't confront Leland about it or bother to gather additional evidence of their past family dramas. What I had already seen and heard was more than enough for one simple, sober conclusion. What was forming around me was not a loving family ready to accept me as an equal partner, but a well-oiled machine, accustomed to gradually, step by step, appropriating others' achievements under the guise of family care and fairness. Nevertheless, we didn't call off the wedding, and here, I should probably admit honestly that the decision to go through with the official registration of our relationship was not dictated by a naive belief that everything would somehow work itself out. I had made the decision to break away from this family the very second I overheard that conversation about my condos and someone else's debt through a half-closed door. The only question was when and in what form to announce this decision to have the maximum practical effect. Quietly breaking off the engagement a week before the ceremony would mean leaving Leland and Eleanor on the payroll of my own company for an indefinite period, giving them time to invent a new version of events for mutual acquaintances, and, likely, try to siphon off some corporate funds before I could block the cards. The wedding day, for all its external pomp, was perfectly suited for one decisive action on all fronts at once. Ending the relationship, the employment, and blocking the accounts simultaneously, in front of witnesses, which would preclude any subsequent gossip about who broke their word first. In parallel, I took several sensible steps that any rational entrepreneur in my position would have taken long before such a wedding. I finalized the undisputed status of both condos as my personal, premarital property through notarized documents with my longtime attorney, with whom the studio had been working since its first major projects. I discussed with Bryn a scenario for the immediate termination of employment for any employee in the event of a gross violation of corporate ethics or overtly unlawful actions against management. I also arranged with the bank in advance for the swift blocking of corporate cards linked to the company accounts in case of an emergency. I did all this not because I was planning some grand public scandal at my own wedding, but because years of running my own business had taught me a simple truth. Preparedness is never excessive. A person who has built something valuable with their own hands is obligated to think in advance about how to protect that value from any threat, no matter how unlikely it may seem at first glance, instead of naively hoping for the decency of people who have already demonstrated the opposite. One evening, just a few weeks before the wedding date, I was working late at my studio, sorting through documents for a major project. The final invoices for the finishing work on a large suburban house had just come in, and I wanted to close out the accounting before the end of the week to peacefully immerse myself in pre-wedding preparations. Walking past the conference room where Eleanor usually met with clients to show textile samples, I overheard a fragment of a phone conversation coming from behind the slightly ajar door. Her voice sounded unusually sharp and nervous, not at all like at family dinners where she usually maintained the theatrical confidence of someone completely in control. She was demanding a little more time from the unseen person on the other end, her voice cracking as she explained that everything would be resolved right after the wedding, and that they mustn't rush things, or will spook her. The person on the other end, it seemed, was not willing to wait indefinitely. Fragments of what sounded like threats reached me something about overdue months and a final deadline, after which interest would start accruing. And at one point, Eleanor, completely losing her usual composure, almost shouted a phrase that stuck in my memory for a long time. "Trust me. She has 2 condos, free and clear. No mortgage, nothing. That's more than enough to cover our entire debt in one go. Just give me a few more weeks." I froze by the door, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. A minute later, when the conversation shifted to a more subdued, calmer tone, I quietly walked back to my office. I finally understood not only the impending attempt on my property but also its true motive. This wasn't abstract greed for greed's sake. It was a very specific, time-sensitive debt pit that Eleanor had apparently dug for herself, tempted by someone's enticing investment offer. And she intended to pay for her own carelessness, not with her own resources, but with my hard work, hidden in the concrete and hardwood of the 2 condos I had renovated. I didn't burst into the room with angry accusations. I didn't immediately call Leland demanding an explanation. Instead, I quietly closed my folder of documents, calmly left the studio building, got into my car, and drove home in complete silence, contemplating what I had heard with the cold clarity that comes when all previously scattered suspicions finally click into a single, complete picture. Now I knew for sure not only that the Ashers planned to appropriate my condos, but also exactly why they needed to do it right now, at the moment of our official marriage registration. According to their calculations, that was when I was supposed to be most vulnerable to a public scandal and least prepared for decisive resistance. The next day, without letting on that I knew anything, I invited Mr. Davies for a short consultation, citing a desire to be extra careful before the wedding, just in case. He listened to my request, adjusted his glasses with his customary index finger gesture, and dryly remarked that being extra careful before a wedding was the most sensible decision a bride in this city could make. A pity, he added, that they usually only remember this after the divorce. I couldn't help but smile at his phrasing, as he prepared additional confirmation that the funds for the purchase and subsequent renovation of both condos were obtained exclusively from my personal income, long before my relationship with Leland began. He added that, in his nearly 20 years of practice, he had seen dozens of stories where family unity turned out to be a polite name for a common property grab. My case, it seemed, would be no exception to this sad rule. In parallel, I arranged with my bank that upon receiving a specific, pre-arranged signal from me, the company's corporate cards linked to Leland and Eleanor's accounts would be blocked within minutes. All current HR correspondence was prepared so that their termination could be carried out instantly, without a single day's delay. The bank manager who arranged this service for me, a common precaution for business owners against employee fraud, asked only once, with delicate bewilderment, if the cards I was asking to prepare for emergency blocking really belonged to my future relatives. Upon receiving an affirmative answer without any explanation, he continued his work in silence, having clearly decided that the details of this story were best left outside the scope of official instructions. A week before the wedding, Leland, suspecting nothing of my actions, came home in high spirits and ecstatically announced that his mother had finally come up with a wonderful surprise for the whole family, one that would make our wedding truly unforgettable. When I cautiously asked for details about this surprise, he just smiled mysteriously, saying his mom had asked to keep it a secret for now to preserve the element of surprise. And at that moment, I could barely contain an involuntary smile, understanding perfectly well what kind of surprise he was actually talking about. The wedding preparations continued as scheduled in those final days. The dress fitting, final approval of the banquet hall, the ceremony rehearsal. Outwardly, I remained a completely calm bride, fully immersed in the usual hustle and bustle. Although inside, a completely different, much more sober and resolute state had long since settled in. I now knew for sure that this day would not be the beginning of a new family chapter for me, at least not in the way the Ashers envisioned it. As for what kind of day it would become, that was now for me alone to decide, and I was going to make that decision firmly, without a single moment of hesitation, precisely when I deemed it necessary, and not when someone else's carefully planned script demanded it. Once, shortly after Leland's sincere and touching proposal, he got down on one knee right in the middle of my studio. Among samples of hardwood and rolls of wallpaper, I jokingly asked him why he had taken so long to decide. He, blushing slightly, answered honestly that his mother always said, "Don't rush. Wait for the moment when everything is definitely in your favor. Because she always gets what she wants. Sooner or later, you just have to know how to wait." At the time, that phrase sounded to me like a harmless family saying, a sweet quirk of a loving mother. But months later, recalling it again and again, I heard in it not a caring piece of advice, but the formulation of a whole life principle, one that Eleanor followed far more literally than one might have guessed at first glance. Meanwhile, Kinsley kept persistently asking about the details of my wedding attire and regularly offered her help in organizing the banquet, although her actual contribution to the preparations was limited to endless discussions about the color palette and the appetizer menu. I politely accepted her advice, showing no irritation, because I understood perfectly well that any sharpness from me now could prematurely alert the entire family and deprive me of the opportunity to see their true intentions in their full, undisguised frankness, precisely at the moment they themselves deemed appropriate. In these last pre-wedding weeks, Richard became noticeably more silent than usual. He slouched even more than before, and his habit of studying people over his glasses was replaced by a much more restless, darting glance, the look of a man burdened by some heavy knowledge. Once, when we were alone in the kitchen for a cup of tea while the others were in the living room discussing the color of napkins, he said, In a surprisingly quiet and almost apologetic tone, "Ilara, you're a smart girl. Try not to judge us too harshly, whatever happens next." Then, after a pause, he added that Eleanor had once lost everything she had in her youth due to someone else's dishonesty. And since then, she's lived with the single thought that she can't let it happen a second time, even if it means stepping over someone else. I didn't pay much attention to those words at the time, dismissing them as ordinary elderly sentimentality before a major family event. But later, I realized it was probably the only sincere attempt to warn me of what was coming. The only one, this quiet man, who had lived too long in the shadow of his domineering wife, was capable of. And he had, it seemed, co-signed his name for that very risky loan she had talked about on the phone, meaning he stood to lose much more in this story than just his reputation as a bystander to family drama. The night before the wedding, Bryn came over, supposedly to discuss some final work matters on current projects, but her real purpose was much more important. She laid out a printed list on my kitchen table, not a bouquet list or a seating chart, but a short, 5-point checklist. The bank manager's phone number, the pre-drafted termination order awaiting only a date and signature, Mr. Davies's contact information, a template for an announcement to the studio staff, and, as a separate item, a simple reminder, bring a fully charged phone. As I looked at this ruthlessly pragmatic piece of paper, she added in her signature dry tone, "Weddings are for pretty pictures, not for forgetting basic safety procedures." I couldn't help but laugh, remarking that the list looked more like a fire evacuation plan than wedding prep. Unfazed, Bryn replied, "In essence, it's the same thing. It's just that, in your case, the smoke isn't visible to the naked eye yet." She calmly, without excess emotion, went over the entire action plan with me one more time, in case my intuition proved correct, and the Asher family did decide to make a public move right during the celebration. Not to talk me out of the wedding, but to ensure that in the decisive moment, whatever it might be, I would act quickly, precisely, and without a second of doubt. "You've already made your decision," she said then, looking me straight in the eye without the shadow of sympathy typical of ordinary friends in such situations. "Just don't let a pretty dress and pretty music make you change your mind at the last second. And yes, for the love of God, wear shoes you can actually walk to a stage in quickly, not those killer heels you chose purely out of vanity." I went to sleep the night before the wedding surprisingly calm, far calmer than I would have expected of myself. All the anxiety, the entire weight of the past few months, seemed to have settled inside me into a single, dense, clear ball of resolve. As I drifted off to sleep, I mentally reviewed my plan one last time. The documents for the condos were impeccable. The bank was ready to block the corporate cards at my word. The termination of Leland and Eleanor could be processed in minutes with an official order. And the microphone that would inevitably be somewhere nearby at any self-respecting wedding reception tomorrow would become for me not just a technical device for toasts, but the most reliable instrument for restoring justice that could possibly be imagined under the circumstances. The morning of the wedding began with the bustle of makeup artists, the rustle of tulle, and the familiar pre-celebration excitement, which I carefully feigned for those around me. Inside, however, an almost surgical clarity of thought reigned. At one point, left alone in front of the mirror for just a couple of minutes, I suddenly felt a brief, almost childlike tremor in my hands. It wasn't fear of the impending confrontation, but a simple human sadness for the image of a happy day that I had imagined for so long, and which I was now about to shatter with my own hands. I allowed myself that weakness for exactly a few seconds, took a deep breath, adjusted my veil, and put that feeling away where I usually put all superfluous emotions before difficult negotiations. In a distant, securely locked drawer of my self-control, Leland, popping in to see me before the ceremony in a perfectly tailored suit but with hands slightly trembling with nerves, looked unusually agitated and repeated several times that today, finally, everything will fall into place. It was a phrase that just yesterday would have sounded like a normal romantic cliché. But today, to me, it sounded almost like an official declaration of war, the beginning of which was only a matter of a few remaining hours. The banquet hall, which we had chosen with so much effort and stress several months ago, was transformed by evening. Garlands of light, fresh flowers, long tables laden with hors d'oeuvres. Everything looked exactly as I had imagined when planning this celebration back when I sincerely believed in a happy future with a man who, it turned out, was merely a convenient screen for much more calculating people behind him. I didn't regret for a second the effort or money spent on the preparations, because I understood perfectly well that this evening would not be the finale of my story, but just another chapter where I, and no one else, would write the decisive plot twist. Guests gradually arrived, found their seats, exchanged greetings and compliments on my dress. Among them, my father's sister stood out, a loud, straightforward woman who, upon crossing the threshold of the hall, loudly announced to the whole lobby, "Finally, a wedding in this family, and not another funeral for ambition." A jab at my years of dedication to my business. The remark drew a chorus of laughter from some guests, and made me, for a moment, genuinely smile amidst all the calculated internal tension. It was a reminder that not everyone in this room was a participant in someone else's shrewd games. Standing at the entrance with Leland and accepting congratulations, I surreptitiously watched Eleanor. She was being conspicuously festive and lively, circulating among the guests with the perfectly rehearsed smile of a hostess in charge, while constantly glancing at the small watch on her wrist, her expression that of someone awaiting a crucial, carefully planned moment. Kinsley fussed over the seating arrangements with an uncharacteristic diligence, repeatedly adjusting the name cards, as if something far more important than table aesthetics depended on their perfect placement. Richard, by contrast, sat motionless at the main table, staring at his own hands with the look of a man who had finally resigned himself to the inevitable course of events, one he was powerless to stop, even if he desperately wanted to. The first toast was given by Leland's parents, or rather, by Eleanor, while Richard nodded silently beside her. She spoke warmly and touchingly, skillfully juggling words about true family and the union of hearts, which brought genuine tears of emotion to some guests at the back tables, and from me, only a cold admiration for the mastery with which this woman could deliver falsehoods, so they sounded more convincing than any sincerity. I stood next to Leland, listening to the clinking of glasses and the low hum of approving voices, feeling the cool silk of my dress against my wrists. And it was in that moment, watching the sincere faces of people who had no idea the celebration was about to turn into something entirely different, that I felt a slight pang of regret. Not for myself, but for them. For these innocent people who would remember this evening not as they had imagined it when they set out for a normal wedding of acquaintances or relatives. However, that regret quickly dissolved in the cold realization that there was no point in delaying the inevitable any longer. The longer I allowed this performance to continue, the more people would be drawn into someone else's lie. And with every minute of delay, my own role in this farce would look more and more like silent consent. And I was not about to give my silent consent to anyone, especially not to the people who, according to the overheard conversation, were already counting down the minutes until they could announce my generous gift to the entire assembly. Leland and I had just finished the traditional champagne toast, linking arms in the customary gesture, and were about to bow to the assembled guests as a sign of gratitude for their presence. But then Eleanor, not waiting for the end of the formalities, strode purposefully towards us, her face that of someone who had decided not to postpone things for another minute. The noise in the hall began to die down noticeably. Guests at the nearby tables involuntarily turned their heads in our direction. I felt my heart begin to beat faster, not from nervousness, but from the anticipation of a long-awaited moment. I calmly turned to face my approaching mother-in-law, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever she was about to say out loud in front of all these people, my response was already prepared, down to the last letter, rehearsed inside me no less thoroughly than any professional presentation to the most demanding client. Eleanor stopped a step away from me. The first thing I noted with the almost detached calm of an observer was how her ring-laden fingers trembled as she crumpled the edge of her silk shawl, as if the shawl had suddenly become too heavy for her shoulders. By that point, the hall had grown so quiet that you could hear a fork clink against a plate at a nearby table, and several waiters along the wall froze with their trays, clearly sensing that the celebration had taken an unexpected turn. "Elara," she began, stumbling slightly over my name as if confusing me with some other daughter-in-law from a long-forgotten story. "Today is such a wonderful day for our family, and while all our loved ones are gathered here, I want to say something important, something that has been on my mind for a long time." She scanned the room, clearly expecting the audience's support, and continued, louder now, addressing the guests more than me. "Elara, you are becoming part of our family, and in the Asher family, it has been a tradition for generations that the property of a young couple should be joint and transparent, with no division into mine and yours. You have 2 condos, both in perfect condition with no mortgages. And I believe it is right and fair that today, on your wedding day, you sign them both over to my name, as a sign of true trust and true kinship." A short, stunned murmur went through the hall. Some guests seemed to think they had misheard. Others were already exchanging bewildered glances, unsure if this was a joke or a serious demand. As for me, standing before her in my wedding dress, I felt not anger or panic, but that same cold, almost surgical clarity of thought I had only experienced before in the most difficult negotiations with unscrupulous contractors. And that very calmness, judging by her slightly dazed look, caught Eleanor completely off guard, far more than the tears or screams she had obviously been expecting from me. "Both condos," I repeated calmly, without a hint of surprise in my voice, as if we were discussing the banquet menu and not the transfer of my entire property. "To your name? Today?" Eleanor gave a short nod, clearly mistaking my calm tone for the beginning of surrender. She added more confidently, "Exactly. And if you refuse, I'm afraid there will be no wedding today. We simply cannot consider you part of our family. And without true trust, what is this celebration for anyway?" Leland, standing next to me, had not said a single word this whole time. He just lowered his head, staring at the toes of his polished shoes. His fingers, which he nervously fiddled with a button on his jacket, betrayed far more inner tension than any words could have expressed. I turned to him, expecting some reaction, some attempt to defend me against his own mother. But he just gave me a short, almost guilty look and murmured quietly, "Mom's right. It's for our family." And in that moment, I finally understood. The 3 years I had spent with this man were not years of a true partnership, but years of carefully disguised preparation for this very evening. Kinsley, standing a little way off by the head table, rushed to support her mother, throwing up her hands as if witnessing a terrible injustice. "Alara, stop clinging to those walls. You'll still have your business. Why do you need condos too? Family is more important than any square footage." Richard, on the other hand, sat motionless at the head table, staring into his glass as if a private, invisible battle was raging inside him, a battle whose nature I already understood perfectly well. Remembering his recent words in the kitchen, seeing that I was in no hurry to either agree or faint from outrage, Eleanor apparently decided to play her last card, public humiliation, calculated on the assumption that in front of so many guests, I would prefer to yield rather than air our dirty laundry. "Alara," she said, louder now, addressing the hushed tables more than me personally. "Are you sure you want to quarrel with our family right now? I could remind everyone where a modest girl with no rich parents suddenly got the money for her first apartment and to open a whole studio. Didn't you perhaps start with a small loan from Leland's acquaintances? A loan you conveniently forgot to mention in your numerous press interviews?" A new, much more wary murmur rippled through the hall. Some guests, clearly unaware of my real biography, leaned forward with interest, expecting a scandalous exposé. Behind her mother, Kinsley smiled vindictively, as if already savoring my confusion. I, however, just gave a short, dismissive laugh at this attempt, feeling how the absurdity of the accusation was finally freeing me from any last doubts about the necessity of ending this evening once and for all. "An interesting theory," I replied in an even voice. "But fortunately for me, I have all my bank statements from those years. And my first loan, since we're on the subject of loans, was not from Leland's acquaintances who didn't even exist in my life at that time, but from a regular commercial bank at a standard interest rate. And I paid it off in full 2 years ahead of schedule. That story, by the way, can be easily verified. Now or tomorrow." Unlike some other financial stories that have surfaced this evening, Eleanor faltered for a moment, clearly not expecting her attempt to tarnish my reputation to be met with such a calm and factual response. But she immediately launched a new attack, this time appealing to the emotions of the crowd. "Fine, let's say the money is clean," she said, her voice rising as she theatrically pressed a hand to her chest. "But think of our grandchildren. The ones Richard and I don't have yet, but who will surely come if you don't ruin everything today with your stubbornness. Don't you feel any pity? Depriving your future children of security by refusing to share with your husband's family what will one day be inherited by your children anyway?" This phrase, delivered with a clear calculation to play on the sentimentality of the predominantly older audience, elicited approving nods from some guests. An elderly relative at a neighboring table even dabbed her eyes with a napkin, clearly moved by the mention of unborn grandchildren. I noted to myself, with a kind of cold admiration, how skillfully this woman could manipulate various levers of pressure, from money to emotions, choosing the most effective argument for each specific audience. Future children, if they ever appear, I replied calmly, will inherit far more security from a mother who knows how to defend what she has earned through honest labor than from a mother who easily gives it away to the first person who raises their voice at her at the dinner table. Leland, who had been silent until now, suddenly tried to intervene, clearly sensing that the tide of public opinion was slowly but surely slipping from his family's grasp. Alara, listen, Mom is just a little emotional today. Everyone's nervous before a wedding. Let's not make any hasty decisions we might regret later. But his voice still held no attempt to protect me, only a desire to smooth over the awkwardness of the moment as quickly as possible and return to the familiar script of the celebration, as if nothing terrible had happened at all. A hasty decision, Leland? I said, turning to him for the first time all evening with a direct, unblinking gaze. A hasty decision is when someone tries to get a share in someone else's real estate under the guise of an insurance formality. What's happening right now is a decision I've been postponing for far too long, out of a final, almost exhausted hope that the people around me are capable of sometimes putting decency above their own self-interest. The guests at the nearest tables fell even quieter. One of the groom's young relatives, who had been sitting with a bewildered expression, quietly whispered to his neighbor something like, "You know, it's true. Leland never really worked." The fragment of the sentence reached me. It was clear enough to show that not everyone in the hall was as blinded by the Ashers family authority as Eleanor had calculated. Kinsley, feeling the crowd turning against them, decided to join the attack with her own dose of emotional pressure, crossing her arms over her chest with the air of an offended, virtuous woman. "You know, Alara, we all sincerely tried to welcome you into the family, even though you're always busy with your business and hardly ever come to family holidays. And in return, you give us this public humiliation right at the wedding. I think that's extremely ungrateful of you." I looked at her with a faint, almost pitying surprise, noting the familiar, well-known squint of one eye that invariably accompanied her less than sincere statements. "Ungrateful, Kinsley, would be allowing you to continue seeing me as a convenient source of funding just to maintain the appearance of a peaceful family dinner. By the way, since we're on the topic of being busy with business, you yourself have seemed significantly busier than usual lately. But it seems it wasn't with event projects, was it?" Kinsley flinched almost imperceptibly at this remark, thrown out as if in passing. At that moment, I had no idea how accurate this casual observation would prove to be in just a few minutes. Eleanor, however, quickly tried to steer the conversation back to the main topic, clearly not wanting her daughter to become the center of unwanted curiosity just yet. "Enough of this beating around the bush, Alara. Are you signing the documents for the condos today, here, in front of witnesses, or are we, right now, in front of everyone, declaring this wedding off? Let the whole city gossip then about which one of us turned out to be the petty, greedy person, incapable of a real sacrifice for family." It was that last phrase, delivered with unconcealed triumph wedding off, that became the final, definitive signal for me. The attempts to appeal to my conscience were exhausted. The attempts to play on my fear of public opinion were exhausted. All that was left was a direct, undisguised threat of a public scandal, which this woman apparently considered her most reliable weapon. A weapon, however, that only works against those who have something to hide or who truly fear others' opinions more than their own dignity. And I, to her profound future disappointment, had never been one of those people. I scanned the hall, hundreds of faces frozen in tense anticipation of my answer. The long tables with their cooling appetizers, the garlands of light under the ceiling casting warm glows on the white tablecloths. I felt a strange, almost detached calm. The calm of a person on the verge of a decision that had long ceased to be difficult, remaining only a question of the right moment to announce it. Somewhere at a nearby table, my aunt caught my eye and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Go on, I'm with you." And Bryn, by the far wall, subtly adjusted the clutch on her shoulder, a pre-arranged signal that all procedures on her end were ready to be launched at my command. I didn't enter into a long argument. I didn't indignantly protest the obvious absurdity of the demand. and I certainly didn't allow myself a single tear. Instead, I did what I always do when faced with a dishonest partner trying to change the terms of a deal at the last minute. I calmly, without rushing, assessed the situation and made the decision I had, in essence, made long ago, long before this evening. Now was simply the moment to voice it. Before I answer, I said in an even voice, addressing not just Eleanor but all the guests who had unwittingly become witnesses, I want to clarify one detail. Leland, do you remember that document you asked me to sign last week, during my final dress fitting? The one you called a formality for the insurance company in case of any issues with the wedding planner? Leland flinched and turned so pale that even the guests at the nearest tables noticed. Without waiting for his answer, I turned to the rest of the guests and explained in a calm, almost professorial tone. It was an attempt to add him as a co-owner of one of my condos, a document which, of course, I read carefully before signing, and of course did not sign, citing, I was too busy. It's quite a coincidence that the same topic has come up again today, but in a much more insistent form, don't you think? The murmur in the hall grew noticeably louder. Someone was openly whispering and shaking their head. The waiters by the wall exchanged quick, eloquent glances, clearly understanding that they had seen such formalities for the insurance company before, in other families. Eleanor was momentarily flustered, clearly not expecting me to know about her son's attempt to obtain the document through a backdoor method. But she quickly composed herself and, raising her voice, tried to seize the initiative. That was just a misunderstanding. Leland simply wanted the young couple to have something in common on paper. Is that a crime? A misunderstanding, I repeated thoughtfully, as if tasting the word. Then I turned to face her directly. All right. Then let's clear up another misunderstanding. About 3 weeks ago, working late at the studio, I accidentally overheard your phone conversation through a half-closed door. Something about an urgent debt that needed to be paid off right after the wedding, and about how my condos were free and clear and more than enough to cover it all in one go. Perhaps you could explain to the guests what that debt was, since we've decided to be so open with each other today. Eleanor's face instantly broke out in red splotches. She opened her mouth, clearly intending to object, but couldn't find the words. At the head table, Richard slowly, heavily, lowered his head, as if the last hope of preserving dignity had just evaporated. Kinsley fell silent, her eye-squinting habit gone for the first time all evening. An openly indignant rumble spread through the hall. Someone shouted, "So that's what this whole wedding was for." And that phrase, thrown from the back rows, hung in the air, heavier than any accusation of my own. I am not going to hold a lengthy court trial here, I said, my voice still calm as I looked at the bewildered faces of the guests. Inwardly, I'll admit, a storm of years of disappointment was raging, but the truth in this situation was brutally simple and needed no lengthy proof. I was being used as a source of financing for someone else's problems, hidden behind words of family and trust. The only real trust in this story, from the very beginning, was my own, and it was shamelessly exploited. I paused for a second, scanned the waiting hall, then turned to the nearby stand with the wireless microphone, left there after the groom's parents' toast. I walked towards it with a confident stride, feeling the cool metal of the microphone pleasantly chilling my suddenly sweaty palm. Eleanor, seeing me reach for the mic, was momentarily confused. Then, apparently thinking I was about to give a conciliatory speech and finally yield to the pressure of so many witnesses, she said hastily, "Elara, wait, let's not do this in front of everyone. Let's discuss it calmly after the party." But her voice was no longer commanding and confident, but almost pleading, with that characteristic note of panic that appears in people who suddenly feel control slipping through their fingers faster than they had planned. I brought the microphone to my lips, and my voice, amplified by the speakers, carried through the entire banquet hall with a clarity that silenced even the farthest tables. Distinguished guests, thank you all for taking the time to be here today. I know you were expecting a wedding, beautiful toasts, and the first dance of the newlyweds. And I am sincerely sorry that you have to witness a far less romantic scene instead. But the truth is always more important than a pretty picture. The hall fell so silent you could hear the soft crackle of the string lights. I took a short pause, looked directly into Leland's pale face, and delivered the very phrase for which, as it turned out, this entire evening had been designed. The wedding is off. Everyone is free to go. Congratulations to the groom and his mother. As of this minute, you are both fired, and your accounts are blocked. A shockwave seemed to ripple through the hall. Someone gasped. Someone else jumped to their feet. Kinsley let out a short, almost hysterical laugh, clearly thinking she had misheard. Leland stood motionless, as if struck by lightning, his lips moving silently without a sound. Eleanor, completely losing her composure, lunged at me, grabbing my free arm with a strength surprising for her age. What do you mean fired? What do you mean blocked? You have no right to do this to family, at a wedding. I have every right, I replied calmly, gently freeing my arm from her grip. Because you are not members of my family in the legal sense of the word. You are employees of my company, officially hired with employment contracts and job descriptions which, by the way, you have been performing with extreme negligence. And an employment contract, unlike a marriage, can be terminated with nothing more than a phone call, especially when the employer has sufficient grounds for dismissal for gross violation of corporate ethics, to which I would probably add today's attempt at public blackmail. From the hidden pocket on the waistband of my dress, a feature I had thoughtfully arranged with the seamstress, who widened the seam for this very purpose, I pulled out my phone. Without taking the microphone from my lips, I typed a short message to my bank manager. In 5 minutes, the corporate cards tied to the accounts of Leland Asher and Eleanor Asher will be completely blocked, I announced loudly, so everyone in the hall could hear. And the HR department has already received instructions for their immediate termination, with the appropriate entry in their employment records. No severance pay beyond what is legally required, because the law, unlike some people present, is something I always follow scrupulously. The initially bewildered guests began to exchange glances with a different expression. Some shook their heads sympathetically, looking at the groom's family. Others, judging by the snippets of conversation I could hear from the nearest tables, were quietly discussing how it was obvious from the start that this family was way too interested in the bride's money. Leland, finally finding the strength to speak, rushed toward me, his face distorted with desperation. Alara, please, don't do this. I know Mom was wrong, but let's handle this without a public scandal. I'll talk to her. We'll fix everything. But there wasn't a hint of real anger at his own mother in his voice for putting him in this humiliating position. There was only the panic of a man who had, in one instant, lost his wife, his job, and the comfortable lifestyle that, as it turned out, was not paid for by his own labor. Fix what, exactly? I asked, not raising my voice, but every word was crystal clear thanks to the microphone. The fact that for 3 years you were listed as creative director at my company, drawing a full salary, yet never once saw a single project through to completion without my constant supervision? Or the fact that your mother arranged a consultant's salary for herself, despite providing exactly 2 fabric samples in her entire time with the company, both of which were unsuitable for real projects. Or maybe the fact that a week ago, you tried to fraudulently obtain a share in my real estate under the guise of an insurance formality? A tense, almost ringing silence fell over the hall. Then, one of the older guests, sitting near the head table who turned out to be a distant relative of the Ashers, come specially for the occasion, said loudly. More to himself than to me. I told you, Richard, you can't treat other people's hard work like that. It ain't right. And that short, almost muttered phrase suddenly rang out in the silent hall, louder than any shout, causing Richard to flinch and finally lift his head from the glass he had been staring into as if it held all the answers. Kinsley, recovering from the initial shock, lunged into another attack with the same fervor she usually used to defend her imaginary event projects. You set this all up on purpose. You knew beforehand and were just waiting for the right moment to disgrace our family in front of all our guests. I just shrugged calmly, looking her straight in the eye. I didn't set up anything, Kinsley. I just stopped pretending not to see the obvious, and chose a moment to stop being silent. By the way, since we're being so candid, what event projects have you been organizing all these months? The ones for which not a single photograph ever seemed to exist? Kinsley instantly fell silent, her face flushing a deep red. I knew I had hit the mark far more accurately than I intended. Clearly, behind the glamorous stories of private fashion shows and investor parties, something was hiding that she herself wouldn't want to discuss in front of so many witnesses. Eleanor, seeing the hall's opinion rapidly turning against her family, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. All right. Maybe I was hasty about the condos, she said, her tone noticeably softer as she tried to force a semblance of a guilty smile. But are you really willing to ruin a whole wedding, a whole family, over one unfortunate conversation? Think of the guests. Think of your reputation. You're a businesswoman. You should understand the value of compromise. I understand the value of compromise perfectly well, I replied, feeling a weary, sobering calm settle over me. That's why I know for a fact that a compromise with people who consider my property theirs by right of marriage before it's even official will cost me far more than any awkwardness in front of tonight's guests. A businesswoman's reputation is built not on her willingness to silently give away what she's worked so hard for, but on her ability to stop those who try to take advantage of that work. I looked around the hall at the faces frozen in tense anticipation and, after a short pause, added more gently, addressing the guests directly. My apologies for the ruined evening. But the food is paid for. The band is playing until midnight, so please, stay and enjoy the party, just without a bride and groom in the leading roles. This last phrase, delivered with a note of dry humor unexpected in the situation, drew nervous but genuine laughter from some guests. Someone even applauded, as if watching not the collapse of a wedding, but a particularly well-executed theatrical performance. The MC, who had been standing bewildered at his console, uncertainly reached for the sound system, clearly not knowing whether to play the prepared background music or just stay out of it. And it was that laughter, though not directly aimed at the Ashers, that finally broke what was left of their composure. Kinsley sobbed and ran out of the hall, her hand clamped over her mouth. Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the room, looking like a general whose army had just collectively surrendered in front of the enemy. Richard, who had remained silent until this point, unexpectedly rose from the table. He moved slowly, heavily, leaning on the edge of the table with his large, age-spotted hand, as if every movement was a great effort. He walked up to me, took off his glasses, and wearily rubbed the bridge of his nose. He spoke quietly, but so that everyone at the nearest tables could hear. Alara is right. We acted dishonestly, not just to her, but to each other, because this family has long been held together not by love, but by debts that I foolishly agreed to co-sign. Eleanor whirled on her husband, a look of genuine horror on her face, as if he had just said aloud what was forbidden even to think in their family, let alone say in front of strangers. Richard. Be quiet this instant. But Richard, it seemed, had finally made a long brewing decision, and was not about to back down. Enough of being quiet, Eleanor, he said, his voice tired but firm. I put my name on your loan almost a year ago because you swore it was a one-time investment that would pay off quickly. Instead, we've spent all these months waiting for a miracle that was supposed to happen tonight, at someone else's wedding, on someone else's dime. The guests, having completely forgotten about decorum, were now openly whispering. Someone from the younger crowd at a back table was even surreptitiously filming the scene on their phone, clearly aware they were witnessing a story that would be retold for years to come. I listened to my would-be father-in-law's unexpected confession with a mixed feeling. On one hand, it confirmed everything I already knew. On the other, for the first time this entire difficult evening, something akin to genuine remorse flickered in this tired, older man, not feigned, not calculated for an audience, but real, coming from the depths of years of silent complicity. I felt no forgiveness for him, nor any particular pity, but I at least acknowledged to myself that of this entire family, he was the only one who, in the decisive moment, chose honesty over another attempt to save face at any cost. Leland, seeing his father essentially confirm the whole sordid story in front of the guests, made one last, truly desperate attempt to fix things. He grabbed my wrist, not roughly, more imploringly, and spoke in a rapid, breaking voice. Alara, I didn't know all the details about the debt, I swear. I thought Mom just wanted to consolidate family assets for the future. I would never have let it get this far if I understood the scale of it. But I gently, without sharpness, but decisively, freed my hand and looked at him with the calm regret one has for a familiar but finally exhausted story. Maybe you really didn't know all the details of the debt, I said quietly, without the microphone now, just for him, though the nearest guests heard every word. But you definitely knew about the attempt to get me to sign a document for co-ownership of the condo under the guise of an insurance formality. Because you handed it to me yourself. You knew your mother and sister were barely fulfilling their duties at my company because you worked alongside them. You just preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions, as long as everything was convenient for you personally. And that, Leland, isn't ignorance. It's the most common, calculated comfort of silence. He opened his mouth to object, but finding no words, just let his hands fall helplessly to his sides. And I, without waiting for the conversation to continue, turned and headed for the side exit of the hall, where Bryn was already waiting for me by the open doors, imperturbable as ever. She had, it turned out, been standing by the far wall the whole time, ready to intervene at any moment if things went off plan. Looking at the unfolding scene, however, her intervention, fortunately, was not needed. "Impressive," she said succinctly, handing me my phone with the banking app already open. On the screen, a notification blinked. "Block successful for 2 corporate cards." Cards are blocked. The HR termination order was e-signed 5 minutes ago. You can see for yourself. I glanced at the screen, confirmed that all technical procedures were indeed impeccably executed, and felt a strange, almost detached relief begin to dawn on the periphery of my consciousness. Not the joy of victory, but rather the feeling of a person who has finally set down an unbearable weight they had been carrying for far longer than they realized. However, we hadn't taken 10 steps from the hall when we heard the quick tap of heels and an anxious woman's voice, one that didn't belong to any of the Ashers. "Excuse me, are you Alara Vance? I urgently need to speak with you, before it's too late." Turning, I saw a middle-aged woman in a severe business suit, clearly out of place at a wedding reception. She had a folder of documents under her arm and an expression of extreme alarm on her face, which immediately told me that the evening, contrary to all my expectations, was far from over. "My name is Miss Albright," the stranger said quickly, as if afraid she would be interrupted before she could finish. "I represent the credit union where Eleanor Asher took out a loan." She paused. "And unfortunately, there is a circumstance that, as I understand it, no one in this family informed you of in advance. And yet, it concerns you personally. In the most direct way." Bryn, beside me, instantly tensed, her whole demeanor signaling readiness for any turn of events. I, feeling that familiar cold focus reawaken within me, simply nodded for the woman to continue. "I'm listening very carefully." Miss Albright hesitated for a second, clearly choosing her words, then delivered a sentence that made my breath catch, despite all my carefully cultivated self-control. "The thing is, about 2 months ago, our bank received a document listing one of your condos as additional collateral for this loan. A document signed, it appears, not by you personally, but by a certain authorized representative, under a power of attorney whose legitimacy our security department now has serious questions about." I felt Bryn stiffen behind me. But I, contrary to any expected panic, felt only another surge of that cold clarity that always took over when a new problem demanded precise action, not emotion. The Lakeshore Drive condo, which was obviously the one in question, was protected by every possible legal safeguard precisely because I had never, under any circumstances, signed a power of attorney for anyone to manage it. This meant the document Miss Albright was talking about was, in any scenario, either a forgery or the result of fraudulent actions committed in my name, without my knowledge. "The power of attorney you're talking about cannot legally exist," I said in an even voice, trying not to let the slight tremor of inner outrage break through, "because I have never granted anyone the authority to dispose of that property. I have all the original title documents, certified by my longtime attorney. I am prepared to provide them for verification at your bank's convenience. But first, I would like to understand who exactly is listed as this authorized representative in the papers submitted to you." Miss Albright opened the folder she was holding, quickly flipped through a few pages, found the document, and said with noticeable reluctance, "The representative under the power of attorney is listed as Kinsley Asher." At that very moment, as if in response to her own name being spoken by a complete stranger, a distinct sound of something falling and shattering came from the hall. It sounded like a champagne glass had slipped from someone's suddenly weak hand. Eleanor, who had been standing nearby and had apparently heard every word of this conversation, turned deathly pale and shot a short, terrified glance toward the doors where her sobbing daughter had disappeared minutes before. I saw her expression change rapidly from astonishment to something resembling panicked calculation as if she were frantically trying to figure out if there was any way to wriggle out of this new, far more serious trouble. "This is a monstrous mistake," she finally said. But for the first time all evening, her voice was utterly unsure, devoid of its former commanding tone. "Kinsley couldn't have forged documents. She just helps me with household papers." She had no malicious intent. "Helps with household papers," I repeated slowly, feeling the last pieces of a puzzle that had been building for months finally click into one completely clear picture. So that's what Kinsley had really been doing all this time, instead of her mysterious event projects. Richard, standing a little to the side, let out a choked, almost soundless gasp and slowly sank into the nearest empty chair, as if his legs had suddenly given out. Judging by his expression, this particular detail was a far more unexpected and painful blow than even his own admission of co-signing the loan. Miss Albright, observing the scene with the professional impassivity of someone used to dealing with all sorts of family dramas surrounding problem loans, neatly returned the documents to her folder and spoke in a drier, more businesslike tone. "In that case, I am obligated to inform you that the bank will be forwarding this matter to law enforcement for investigation into potential fraud involving a forged power of attorney. We will also be suspending all action on this loan until the circumstances are clarified. I'm sorry to have to inform you of this today, of all days, but delaying notification would have been an even greater mistake on our part." I thanked her for her honesty and professionalism, took the business card she offered, and promised to contact the bank the next day to provide all necessary documents to completely refute the forged power of attorney. Miss Albright gave a short nod, apologized again for the ruined evening though, of course, she was in no way to blame, and departed with the same businesslike stride she had arrived with, leaving behind a ringing silence far more oppressive than the one that had followed my own words at the microphone. Eleanor, left without the support of her daughter, who had apparently chosen to hide rather than face her own exposure, made one last attempt to salvage some shred of dignity. "Elara, understand? This was all done out of desperation. I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to save the family from a debt pit I got us into with my own carelessness. Isn't that humanly understandable?" But her voice now held no authority, only a tired, almost pitiful attempt to explain the inexplicable. "It's understandable," I agreed calmly. "Desperation often pushes people to make bad decisions. I understand that perfectly, but desperation doesn't negate the simple fact that you allowed your own daughter to forge documents for someone else's property, and your own son to try to obtain a share in my condo under the guise of an insurance formality. And you did all this instead of honestly coming to me and telling me about the real problems, asking for help as an equal, not as a resource to be silently drained." I paused, looking at this woman who had aged years in an instant, who just an hour ago had seemed the embodiment of confident authority, and now looked completely lost in the wreckage of a party she had destroyed with her own hands. I added more quietly, without the earlier harshness, "I am truly sorry it has come to this, but I am not going to solve your debt problem, just as I am not going to remain silent about the document forgery. To turn a blind eye to that would be to endanger not only myself, but any other person who has the misfortune to find themselves in my place." My aunt, the loud one from my father's side, pushed through the tense crowd at that moment. She took my elbow with a firmness that belied her build and announced to the entire remaining hall, "All right. Enough of this kangaroo court. Let the girl leave in peace. The party's ruined, sure, but life doesn't end here." And in her rough, simple words, there was more genuine care than in all of Eleanor's flowery speeches combined. Just then, a neighbor of the Ashers, an elderly man with a military bearing whom I had only seen briefly at a couple of family dinners, approached. He addressed Eleanor directly, with the frankness that people of a certain age allow themselves. "Eleanor, I suspected for a long time this loan of yours would lead to no good. I told you back at the lake house that there's no such thing as fast money without a fast payback. But you just waved me off." Eleanor flinched, clearly not expecting a public reminder of that conversation as well, but found no strength to reply. She just silently sank onto the chair next to her husband, as if all the air of her long-held self-assurance had been let out at once. Not wanting to linger any longer in that hall full of disappointment and shattered calculations, I turned to Bryn and said simply, "Let's go." We walked toward the exit, escorted not by angry shouts, but by the heavy, oppressive silence of the remaining guests. Only at the very door did Richard's quiet voice reach me, sounding for the first time all evening not apologetic, but with a new, almost detached directness. Alara, I'm calling a lawyer first thing tomorrow to officially withdraw my co-signature and deal with this loan without your involvement. You've endured more than enough from our family for one evening. I turned, gave him a short nod, acknowledging this belated attempt to take some responsibility, and without another word, walked out into the cool evening air where the car was waiting. In the car, settling into the back seat and finally allowing myself to close my eyes for a few seconds, I felt all the tension of the endlessly long evening settle on my shoulders as a heavy, almost physical exhaustion. Bryn, sitting next to me, was silent for a while, watching the city lights flash by, then said in her invariably dry tone, which this time, however, held an unaccustomed warmth, "You handled that as if you've spent your whole life exposing scams in front of 100 guests. I'll admit, I was expecting a few more tears from you." I couldn't help but smile at the observation, feeling the exhaustion gradually give way to a strange, almost weightless relief. I'll save the tears for later, when I've sorted this story out completely. And from the looks of it, we're far from the end. We still need to figure out who helped Kinsley forge a power of attorney so skillfully that it almost got past a major bank's security department. Bryn thought for a moment, then cautiously remarked that forging such documents usually required a certain professional skill, access to signature samples, and knowledge of legal forms. And Kinsley, for all her loud, empty talk about non-existent event projects, had never given the impression of someone capable of pulling off such a technically complex scheme on her own. Listening to this sober reasoning, I couldn't help but recall the slight, almost imperceptible hesitation in Miss Albright's voice when she said Kinsley's name. A hesitation that, upon reflection, seemed much more significant now. "Someone helped her," I said aloud, more thinking than stating it as a fact. "And for some reason, I feel like that someone has not yet revealed their name tonight." Bryn said nothing, just gave a silent nod. The car turned onto the embankment, leaving behind the glow of the banquet hall lights, where I had no doubt the talk of what had happened would not die down for a very long time. But at that moment, I was far more concerned with who was standing behind the bewildered Kinsley, helping her pull off a scam that could have cost me the very roof over my head. My phone vibrated. A message from Mr. Davies, who had apparently already heard about the evening's events from mutual acquaintances. It was short. "Heard about tonight. I'll be waiting for you in my office tomorrow morning with the original condo documents. We'll sort out this power of attorney officially, and I'll find out from the bank the full name of the notary who certified it. I have a bad feeling about this." I reread the message twice, feeling the cold premonition Mr. Davies wrote about transfer to me, because to process even a forged power of attorney, you still need a real, practicing notary, one willing to either turn a blind eye to suspicious details or get involved in something far more serious than simple family greed. "What is it?" Bryn asked, noticing the change in my expression. I handed her the phone. She scanned the text and her eyes narrowed in understanding, her expression still unreadable. "So it's not just Kinsley. All right, we'll deal with it in the morning. For tonight, you should just take off that dress, eat some real food, and get some sleep. Because from the looks of it, the next few days are not going to be calm." I smiled at her pragmatic advice. That kind of sober, businesslike care was exactly what I needed, more than any sympathetic hugs. The car stopped in front of my building, the very space on Lakeshore Drive I had restored with my own hands, where behind a panel in the closet, the original documents that could refute any forgery were still stored. And as I walked up the familiar staircase, still in my wedding dress, disheveled, tired, but surprisingly calm inside, it became clear to me. This evening, as destructive as it seemed, was not the end of something important. It was just the beginning of a much more serious investigation, one where I would have to uncover not only the extent of each Asher's guilt but also the identity of that mysterious notary, whose name, tomorrow morning, would finally be spoken aloud. The morning after the non-wedding didn't begin with a headache or regrets. It began with a cup of strong coffee, sipped standing by the window of my own living room, the very room whose high ceilings and preserved molding had once landed me my first magazine spread, and with a clear, actionable plan for the day ahead. First, Mr. Davies's office. Then the bank. Then, if necessary, the police. And only then, maybe, I'd find a minute to sit in silence and process what had happened. The wedding dress, crumpled and tossed on the bedroom floor the night before, still lay where I'd dropped it, shedding it with the almost physical relief of someone finally taking off an ill-fitting costume. I picked it up, smoothed the hem, and my fingers habitually found the hard little lump of the sewn-in key. Instead of indulging in sentimental thoughts, I pragmatically hung the dress on a hanger in the back of the closet, deciding that now was not the time for emotions. Mr. Davies met me in his office with the same unflappability he'd show any client dealing with a bad lease. He adjusted his glasses, laid out the original deeds for both condos, which I had retrieved from my hidden safe, and quickly compared them to the copy of the forged power of attorney the bank had emailed me. "The notary seal is not from my office," he said curtly, "but the seal and the form are authentic. That means one of two things. A practicing notary either sold a blank form, or they were directly involved in the fraud. How is it possible to fake a document so well that it nearly passes a major bank's security check?" I asked, studying the copy. My signature was close, but the pressure on the last letter of my name was slightly off a detail only someone who had watched me sign hundreds of construction budgets would notice. Mr. Davies shrugged, a man who had seen too much to be surprised. "It's not that hard if you have access to a real notary blank and some connections in the registry. The hard part isn't making the document. It's getting it through the bank unnoticed. And here, it looks like someone got seriously sloppy in their haste." He turned his monitor toward me, pointing to the notary's details in the corner of the document. He squinted, then let out a low whistle of professional disdain. "The seal of Dennis Croft. I know the name, unfortunately. He almost lost his license a few years ago for a similar story with a car title, but it got swept under the rug. I asked him to repeat the name, a sick feeling of coincidence dawning on me. Mr. Davies, checking the public registry, confirmed it. Dennis Croft was Eleanor Asher's younger cousin, the same relative she must have been talking to on the phone that night. The picture snapped into focus with mechanical precision. Eleanor had invested family money in a dubious venture, likely organized by her notary cousin. The money vanished faster than expected. The payback deadline loomed, and the cousin, instead of admitting failure, offered a simpler, albeit criminal, solution. Forge a power of attorney on my condo. He could use Kinsley's access to my personal documents, which she'd occasionally seen at the studio while helping her mother. I called Miss Albright and laid out everything I had learned. She listened intently, thanked me for my speed, and informed me that the bank had already filed a formal inquiry with the state notary board, and that the case would be handed over to the police for a fraud investigation. Listening to her detached, professional voice, I felt not a thirst for revenge, but a tired relief. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. 2 days later, I was at a police station giving a formal statement. The young detective, clearly unaccustomed to victims arriving with a fully prepared packet of documents and a clear timeline, shook his head in surprise. "You seem to have put everything in order before we even spoke." I explained that documenting facts was part of my profession, where a verbal agreement without paperwork sooner or later turns into lost money or a ruined client relationship. That evening, I got a call from a journalist from a local society column, clearly fishing for emotional details about the scandalous non-wedding. I politely but firmly declined to discuss my personal life, suggesting she contact the bank and law enforcement for official comments. My long-standing rule of never mixing personal trauma with public attention had served me well again. Back at the studio, an unusual quiet greeted me. My employees, used to my slightly detached leadership, now looked at me with cautious curiosity. I didn't call a meeting to explain. A boss's personal life isn't a matter for group discussion, but I noticed that a young architect, who had previously worked under Leland, had independently redistributed tasks from a project my ex-fiancé had been responsible for. It was a small but telling detail. The studio would survive this sudden staff reduction just fine. When Bryn arrived, she found me drafting the official police statement. "Written impeccably," she noted in her dry tone, "as if you've spent your whole life filing fraud complaints against your relatives." I had to laugh. It was true I was better at drafting legal documents than wedding toasts. Seeing I was clear-headed, Bryn switched to business. "Now that we're talking about the company's future," she began, her tone cautious, "don't you think it's time we discussed my partnership officially? I've been running the operations for years, and I think yesterday proved I can handle a crisis as well as you can. I thought of all the years her cool-headed pragmatism had saved the studio from my more emotional impulses. Agreed, I said without hesitation. We'll finalize the paperwork by the end of the week. You've more than earned it. Bryn nodded, satisfied. Then, with her trademark irony, she added, So now you'll have to put up with me as a co-owner. I hope you understand that means I get a vote on your personal decisions too, including your choice of future fiancés. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh, for the first time in days. After yesterday, I think I'll be dedicating the next year exclusively to the studio. That answer seemed to satisfy her as a business partner. Over the next few days, the full scope of Eleanor's financial mess came to light. The Ashers were forced to put their large suburban house on the market to cover their debts. My aunt, still gathering gossip, called with an update. Eleanor's telling everyone they're downsizing for retirement, but the whole town knows the real reason. But they say Richard seems relieved. The neighbors saw him fixing a fence at a much more modest place he's looking at, whistling like a man with a great weight off his shoulders. A week later, Richard called me himself. His voice was tired but firm. He'd hired a lawyer and officially withdrawn his name from his wife's loans. To my surprise, he added that he had insisted Eleanor and Kinsley cooperate fully with the investigation. Hiding from the consequences of your actions is not something I want to teach my future grandchildren, he said, a note of profound sadness in his voice. For 30 years, Alara, I kept quiet when Eleanor made decisions I disagreed with, thinking peace in the house was more important than the truth. Yesterday you showed me where that silence leads. It's an unpleasant, but timely, discovery for a man my age. Leland sent one final text. I've officially submitted my resignation, so you don't have to deal with the paperwork. I'm sorry for everything. Truly, for the first time in 3 years, I heard a flicker of accountability in his words, but it was too little, too late. I didn't reply. My feelings for him had evaporated, leaving only a quiet, professional void, like after a long finished project. The work was done, the contracts terminated. Any further emotion felt like a waste of energy. The legal process unfolded. Kinsley, it turned out, was little more than a pawn, a courier for her manipulative uncle, ashamed to admit to her mother that her event planning career was just a low-level admin job. Her case was handled separately, her cooperation taken into account. One day, Kinsley showed up at my office, unannounced. Dressed in a simple gray jacket, she looked nothing like her former flashy self. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice stripped of its usual affectations. I just wanted to say it myself. I told the investigators everything. He lied to me. Said it was just a formality. For the first time, she wasn't squinting. She seemed to be telling the truth. What happened was not a misunderstanding, Kinsley, I told her calmly. You'll have to face the consequences for your actions. But I hear that you've stopped hiding behind fake stories. And that, I suppose, is the only thing I can count in your favor right now. She nodded and left, leaving me with the feeling of an untied, but not entirely severed, human knot. 2 months after the non-wedding, I finally returned to my Lakeshore Drive condo, not as a fortress to be defended, but simply as a home. I repainted a hallway, rearranged the living room furniture, and in the evening, sat in my armchair by the window with a cup of tea. For the first time in months, I felt a simple, unburdened, quiet. The key was still sewn into the wedding dress, which I had packed away in the back of the closet, not as a reminder of a failed marriage, but of my own timely resolve. It felt less like a superstitious amulet now and more like a trophy. I no longer needed an escape route, because, for the first time in a long time, my life belonged to me, unconditionally, with no one else trying to lay claim to its foundation. The studio was thriving. Bryn was a full partner. And sometimes, falling asleep in the very apartment I had once brought back from ruin, I'd reflect that the whole long journey from that first bad client to the failed wedding had been one long lesson on the same theme. Trust isn't given for loud words about love and family. It's earned by real, verifiable actions. A wedding hasn't happened for me since then. And honestly, I don't consider that a loss. I learned too well that the true value of one's own home isn't measured by another name on the deed, but by that simple, rare feeling of closing the door at the end of a long day, knowing with absolute certainty that behind it, there is not a single person waiting for a convenient moment to demand a share of what was built exclusively with your own two hands.